Flight attendant said these seats aren't for you to two 8-year-old twin boys. Then the airline CEO walked in and hugged his daughters. The confrontation exploded in business class just as boarding neared completion. Flight attendant Meredith Palmer's voice cut through the pre-flight murmur like a blade. "I'm sorry, but these seats aren't for you," she said, her professional smile tightening as she blocked the aisle with her body. The two young children, short-haired, dressed in nearly identical jeans and comic book t-shirts, froze mid-step, confusion washing over their faces. "These are business class seats," Meredith continued, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You boys need to find your parents in economy." Passengers nearby glanced up from their pre-flight routines, witnessing the tense tableau unfolding in the narrow aisle. No one noticed the tall man who had just boarded, his purposeful stride slowing as he registered the scene. The children's eyes darted from the flight attendant to each other, their matching expressions shifting from confusion to hurt. That's when the tall man in the impeccable suit stepped forward. "Actually," he said, his deep voice resonating with quiet authority, "those are exactly their seats." He moved past Meredith, knelt down, and wrapped the children in a warm embrace. "How are my girls doing?" he asked, looking up at the now-pale flight attendant. "I'm Richard Evans," he added unnecessarily. Everyone in the aviation industry recognized the CEO of Meridian Airlines. "And these are my daughters." But to understand how we got here, how a routine cross-country flight became the flashpoint for a viral moment that would change careers, policies, and lives, we need to go back to where the day began, 12 hours earlier, when the alarm clock in Meredith Palmer's apartment shrilled into the darkness of 4:30 a.m. Meredith's hand smacked the alarm with practiced precision. 23 years as a flight attendant had conditioned her body to early mornings, but it never made them pleasant. She sat up, blinking at the dim outline of her San Francisco apartment. Rental prices kept climbing while her salary didn't, another reminder that at 57 her career had plateaued decades ago. The photo on her nightstand caught her eye, younger Meredith standing proudly in her new uniform, 1990, when flying still felt glamorous and full of possibility. The routine was automatic: shower, coffee, uniform. The navy blue suit still fit well, something she took pride in. Meredith applied her makeup with practiced efficiency, her hands remembering the motions while her mind wandered. Today's flight, San Francisco to New York, was fully booked. Summer travel season always brought chaos, entitled passengers, and unruly children. As she pinned her wings to her lapel, her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter Leanne. "Good luck today, Mom. Dad's being impossible again about the nursing home visit." Meredith sighed. Her ex-husband's deteriorating health had become yet another responsibility on her shoulders. After 30 years apart, she was somehow still managing his problems. She texted back a quick reply, promising to call after her flight landed. The clock read 5:45 a.m., time to go. The pre-dawn streets were mercifully empty as Meredith's rideshare wound through San Francisco toward the airport. She'd long ago abandoned car ownership, another economic casualty of the airline industry's post-9/11 cutbacks. Her driver, a young man who couldn't be more than 25, chatted enthusiastically about cryptocurrency. Meredith nodded politely, her mind already at work, mentally reviewing the flight manifest. A full business class section meant demanding passengers with outsized expectations. At the crew entrance, Meredith badged in, nodding to security. The familiar airport bustle greeted her, the particular sound and smell that hadn't changed in decades, even as everything else in the industry had. In the crew lounge, she spotted several familiar faces. Airline work created strange relationships, people you knew intimately within the confines of metal tubes hurling through the sky, yet barely knew in real life. "Palmer, you're on the JFK run too?" Tom Delaney, a flight attendant who'd started around the same time as Meredith, waved her over. His once black hair had gone completely silver, his face mapped with the same fine lines as hers, badges of high-altitude dehydration and irregular sleep. "Morning, Tom." She settled into the seat beside him. "How's Nancy?" "Loving retirement, keeps asking when I'm going to join her." He sipped his coffee. "You hear about the changes coming?" Meredith tensed. "What now?" "Word is Evans is making another round of seniority revisions. They're looking to optimize crew efficiency." He made air quotes with his fingers. "Corporate speak for pushing us dinosaurs out." The mention of Richard Evans, Meridian Airlines CEO for the past 5 years, sent a familiar ripple of resentment through Meredith. Young, ambitious, and ruthlessly focused on the bottom line, Evans represented everything that had gone wrong with the industry. In her early days, airline CEOs had been aviation people, pilots who'd worked their way up, executives who understood the culture. Evans was a business school wunderkind who treated the airline like any other corporate entity to be streamlined and monetized. "Let them try," Meredith said, although her confidence was hollow. At 57, her options were limited. She'd put Leanne through college on this salary, survived divorce, recessions, and industry upheaval. The thought of starting over terrified her. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the flight's purser, Julia Chen. At 42, Julia represented the mid-career crew, experienced enough to command respect, young enough to adapt to the industry's constant changes. "Morning, team. We've got a full flight to JFK today with several VIPs in business." Julia's efficiency was one of her defining traits. "Boarding starts in 90 minutes. Meredith, you're on business class today." Meredith nodded, secretly pleased. Business class was physically less demanding than economy, though it came with its own challenges, namely, passengers who believed their premium tickets entitled them to extraordinary service. As the crew briefing continued, Meredith's mind drifted to the list of pre-flight checks awaiting her. Another day, another flight. The sameness both comforted and depressed her. 23 years in, and sometimes it felt like she was still waiting for her real life to begin. Across town, in a sleek high-rise overlooking the bay, another alarm had gone off at 5:00 a.m. Richard Evans was already awake, reviewing quarterly reports on his tablet. At 43, he'd been the youngest CEO in Meridian's history when the board appointed him 5 years ago. Now, with the airline's stock up 34% and customer satisfaction metrics showing steady improvement, his position was secure. "You promised no work this morning," came a sleepy voice from the other side of the king-sized bed. Richard looked over at his wife, Amara, her eyes still closed but a knowing smile on her lips. "Just checking the overnight numbers from Asia," he said, putting the tablet aside. "We've got an hour before we need to wake the girls." Amara sat up, her dark hair falling around her shoulders. At 41, she still took his breath away. They'd met at business school. She'd actually graduated ahead of him, her natural brilliance making her a standout even then. Now she ran her own consulting firm, advising Fortune 500 companies on diversity and inclusion strategies. Their schedules were perpetually in conflict, making this rare family trip to New York all the more precious. "They're excited," Amara said, reaching for her water glass. "Emma asked if they could visit the cockpit." Richard smiled. "I'll arrange it. Though I'm not sure if they're more excited about flying or seeing your parents." "Both," Amara stretched. "Mom's been sending them New York countdown texts every morning. I think she's bought out every toy store in Manhattan." Richard felt a familiar pang of guilt. His in-laws saw the twins far too rarely. His own parents, retired in Florida, were equally deprived of time with their granddaughters. Such was the reality of their dual-career household, stretched between obligations and ambitions. "This merger is going to take up a lot of oxygen over the next few months," he admitted. "I'm glad we're doing this trip now." The potential acquisition of Suncoast Airways had been consuming Richard's attention for weeks. If successful, it would cement Meridian's position as a top-3 airline in the country. The board was cautiously supportive, shareholders were optimistic, but the regulatory hurdles were substantial. Not to mention the human cost, consolidation inevitably meant redundancies. "Just be present today," Amara said, squeezing his hand. "The girls need their dad, not the CEO." Richard nodded, making a conscious decision to set aside thoughts of the merger. Today he wasn't flying as the CEO, but as a father. He'd even booked the tickets under Amara's family name, Showri, a small attempt at privacy. Though as one of the few South Asian executives in the industry, anonymity was rarely an option for him. Down the hall in a bedroom decorated with a chaotic mix of space posters and ballet paraphernalia, 8-year-old twins Emma and Olivia were already awake, whispering excitedly. "Do you think we'll get turbulence?" Emma asked, her expression hopeful rather than fearful. Of the two, she was the adventure seeker, always first to try anything new. "I hope not," Olivia replied, more cautious by nature. "But Dad says the pilots know how to handle it." She was leafing through a book on aircraft, a recent obsession. Both girls had inherited their mother's warm brown skin and dark eyes, along with their father's analytical mind. They wore their hair in short, practical styles, their choice much to the chagrin of their grandmother, who regularly sent clips and hairbands that went unused. "Girls," Amara's voice called from the hallway. "Time to get up. We need to leave for the airport in an hour." The twins scrambled out of bed, racing to be first to the bathroom. Today's matching outfits, jeans and t-shirts featuring characters from their favorite graphic novel series, Galaxy Girls, lay ready on their dressers. The shirts had been a point of contention with Richard, who'd suggested more traditional travel attire, but Amara had sided with the girls. "Let them be comfortable," she'd said. "They're children, not corporate accessories." As the Evans-Shorey family prepared for their journey, Meredith Palmer was already at Gate 42, reviewing the cabin preparation checklist with practiced efficiency. The first-class cabin gleamed, each seat impeccably prepared for its premium occupant. Business class, her responsibility for this flight, awaited her attention. Julia approached, tablet in hand. "Heads up, Meredith, we've got a couple of unaccompanied minors in business today." She nodded toward the manifest. "Seats 5A and B," Meredith frowned. "In business, that's unusual. Parents bought the tickets." Julia shrugged. "They're 8 years old, so they don't technically need an escort. Just keep an eye on them." Unaccompanied minors were always a wild card. Some were experienced travelers, quiet and self-sufficient. Others required constant attention, disrupting service for everyone else. And business-class passengers were notoriously intolerant of disturbances to their premium experience. "Perfect," Meredith muttered, adding this complication to her mental list of potential issues. The day stretched before her, long and unpredictable. As boarding time approached, the terminal hummed with activity. Richard led his family toward Gate 42, their carry-on luggage trailing behind them. Despite his attempt at a low profile, he instinctively scanned the operation with a professional eye, noting the efficiency of the gate agents, the cleanliness of the waiting area, the timeliness of the boarding announcements. "You're doing it again," Amara murmured, nudging him gently. "What?" He feigned innocence. "CEO mode, you promised." Richard smiled sheepishly. "Force of habit." He focused instead on the girls, who were comparing their boarding passes with intense concentration. "Dad, we're in 5A and 5B, Emma announced. "Is that a good spot?" "Excellent spot," he assured her. "Window and middle seat, just like you wanted." The decision to let the girls sit together, adjacent to but separate from him and Amara, had been deliberate. At 8, they were developing independence, and this controlled environment seemed an ideal testing ground. He and Amara would be just across the aisle in 5C and 5D, close enough to supervise, but allowing the twins a taste of autonomy. "Boarding will begin in approximately 15 minutes, came the announcement over the PA system. "We'd like to invite our passengers requiring special assistance to board at this time." The gate area was filling quickly. Richard noticed with approval that the boarding lanes were clearly marked, a system he'd implemented last year to reduce congestion. His phone buzzed, an email from his CFO regarding the merger negotiations. He hesitated, then tucked the phone away without reading it. Amara was right. Today was about family. A commotion near the check-in desk caught his attention. An elderly man was becoming increasingly agitated, his voice rising as he gestured at his boarding pass. "That seat was confirmed. I specifically requested an aisle seat due to my medical condition." The gate agent, a young woman with a harried expression, was attempting to placate him. "I understand, sir, but there seems to have been a system error. We're trying to resolve it now." Richard felt the familiar pull of responsibility. A quick intervention from him would likely solve the problem, but it would also blow his cover as an ordinary passenger. He caught Amara's knowing look. "Go," she said with a small smile. "Just make it quick." With a grateful nod, Richard approached the desk, stepping to the side to speak quietly with the supervisor, who recognized him immediately. "Mr. Evans, we didn't realize you were traveling today." "Unofficial trip," he said smoothly. "What's the issue here?" As Richard worked with the staff to resolve the seating problem, which required a quick call to have an executive override code applied, Amara entertained the twins with a game of I Spy. By the time he returned, the elderly passenger had been reassigned to an appropriate seat, and the boarding process was back on track. "Crisis averted?" Amara asked. "Small technical issue, all fixed." Emma tugged at his sleeve. "Dad, can we board now? I want to see the cockpit before everyone gets on." Richard checked his watch. "Let's wait for our boarding group, sweetheart, but I promise you'll get to see the cockpit at some point during the flight." As they waited, Richard observed his daughters with quiet pride. Despite their privileged upbringing, they were remarkably grounded children. He and Amara had been deliberate about instilling values of hard work and empathy, regularly involving the girls in community service from an early age. Still, he worried about the impacts of his demanding career on their development. Too often, he found himself missing school events or arriving home after bedtime. The boarding announcement for first-class passengers interrupted his thoughts. "That's our cue," he told the family, gathering their belongings. As they approached the gate, Richard nodded politely to the agents, who gave no indication they recognized him. The anonymity was refreshing. Today, he was just another passenger, a father taking his family on vacation. In the jet bridge, Emma and Olivia's excitement was palpable. They whispered to each other, their identical Galaxy Girls t-shirts drawing amused glances from other passengers. Richard had suggested more traditional travel attire, but Amara had overruled him. Let them express themselves, she'd said. They're not junior executives. At the aircraft door, they were greeted by Julia Chen, the purser. Richard had met her at a company event last year and was impressed by her professionalism. She showed no sign of recognizing him now, offering the same warm welcome she gave all premium passengers. "Welcome aboard Meridian Airlines. May I see your boarding passes, please?" The girls proudly presented their documents, practicing the travel independence they'd been coached on. "Seats 5A and 5B for you too," Julia smiled. "And 5C and 5D for your parents, right this way." As they followed her into the business class cabin, Richard noted the immaculate presentation, the freshly fluffed pillows, the precisely aligned amenity kits, the spotless surfaces. His operations team would be pleased. The business class cabin was about half full, early boarders already settling into their seats. At row 5, Julia paused. "Here you are, 5A and 5B by the window for the young ladies, and 5C and 5D across the aisle for you." Olivia and Emma slid into their assigned seats with practiced ease, immediately exploring the features of their surroundings. "Look, Dad," Emma called, already figuring out the seat controls. "It goes completely flat," Richard smiled as he stowed their backpacks in the overhead compartment. "Remember, only recline after takeoff and be considerate of the passenger behind you." Amara was already settling into her seat across the aisle, arranging her tablet and water bottle in the side compartment. "Girls, do you have your books?" The twins nodded, pulling out identical copies of the latest Galaxy Girls graphic novel. Their synchronized movements sometimes still startled Richard, the way they could communicate with just a glance, finishing each other's sentences or sharing unspoken jokes. "I'll be right across from you," Richard reminded them. "If you need anything, just ask me or the flight attendants." With a last check that their seatbelts were secure, he took his own seat beside Amara. The pre-flight routine continued around them. Other passengers boarding, flight attendants assisting with luggage, the distant thrum of the aircraft systems coming to life. "They'll be fine," Amara said, noting his frequent glances toward the girls. "This independence is good for them." Richard nodded, though he couldn't help the protective instinct that surged when it came to his daughters. In his position, he was acutely aware of all the things that could go wrong, even on a routine flight. As the boarding process continued, Meredith Palmer moved efficiently through the business class cabin, checking that each seat was properly prepared. When she reached row 5, she was surprised to find 2 young children already seated by the window. The manifest had indicated unaccompanied minors, but she'd been expecting boys based on the names, O. Shoury and E. Shoury. These two, with their short hair and matching t-shirts, certainly looked like boys to her. "Hello there," she said, professional smile in place. "Are you traveling by yourselves today?" The twins looked up from their books. "Our parents are right there," one of them said, pointing across the aisle to where Richard and Amara sat. Meredith glanced over, seeing a well-dressed couple, the woman clearly of South Asian descent, the man surprisingly young-looking for what must be a senior executive position based on his business class seat and confident demeanor. "I see," Meredith replied, slightly confused. The manifest had clearly listed the children as unaccompanied. A system error, perhaps. "Well, if you need anything during the flight, just press your call button." She continued her preparations, making a mental note to check with Julia about the manifest discrepancy. Unaccompanied minors required additional documentation and attention. If these children were traveling with their parents, the paperwork should reflect that. As Meredith completed her checks, the flow of boarding passengers increased. The business class cabin quickly filled with the usual mix of corporate travelers, mostly middle-aged men in dress shirts and slacks, tapping away on laptops or scrolling through phones until the last possible moment. A few glanced curiously at the twins, perhaps surprised to see children in the premium cabin. Across the aisle, Richard observed the interaction between the flight attendant and his daughters with mild interest. He hadn't noticed any particular reaction and was pleased by the professional courtesy shown. Too often, he'd heard from colleagues with children about the subtle disapproval they encountered when traveling with young ones in premium cabins. The final boarding announcement echoed through the aircraft. The business class cabin was now almost full, with just a few remaining passengers filtering in. Richard's attention was caught by a late arrival, a harried-looking man in his 60s, struggling with an overstuffed briefcase. "5F," the man muttered, checking his boarding pass against the seat numbers. His gaze fell on Emma and Olivia seated peacefully with their books. "Are they with you?" he asked Richard, nodding toward the twins. "Yes, they're my daughters," Richard replied. The man settled into his aisle seat with a relieved sigh. "Thank goodness. Last flight I was on had a kid behind me kicking my seat the entire way from Chicago. Parents did nothing." "I can assure you my girls know proper flight etiquette," Richard said, his tone pleasant but firm. The interaction was interrupted by the arrival of a flustered couple, clearly the last to board. They struggled down the aisle with too many carry-on items, holding up the completion of boarding. Richard watched as Meredith approached them, her expression professionally neutral despite what must be frustration at the delay. "Sir, ma'am, we'll need to check some of these bags. Overhead bins are full, and we need to maintain clear aisles." The couple protested, insisting their items were essential and couldn't be checked. Richard recognized the familiar dance, passengers pushing boundaries, crew members enforcing necessary rules. He'd seen it play out countless times in his years with the airline. Julia appeared, backing up Meredith with calm authority. "I'm sorry, but it's a safety regulation. We're happy to gate-check these items for you, and they'll be waiting when you deplane in New York." Finally, the couple relented, surrendering 2 rolling suitcases. As the bags were taken away and the couple directed to their seats, Richard noticed Meredith's subtle sigh of relief. These small conflicts were the invisible friction of air travel, minor stresses that accumulated throughout a flight attendant's day. The cabin door closed with a definitive thunk. The familiar announcements began, first in English, then Spanish. The safety demonstration would follow, a ritual Richard had witnessed hundreds of times but still watched attentively, knowing its critical importance. Emma and Olivia were model passengers during the safety briefing, watching with genuine interest as Meredith demonstrated the oxygen masks and life vests. Richard had made sure they understood the seriousness of these procedures, despite their statistical unlikelihood. As the aircraft began its push back from the gate, the twins exchanged excited glances. Olivia, the more technically minded of the two, was already explaining to Emma how the plane's engines worked, information gleaned from her aviation books. The taxi to the runway was brief, San Francisco's efficient ground operations keeping traffic flowing smoothly. Richard felt the familiar surge of acceleration as the aircraft began its takeoff roll, the engines roaring to full power. Beside him, Amara reached for his hand, not from fear, but from their shared tradition of connecting during takeoff and landing, a silent acknowledgement of the miracle of flight. Across the aisle, Emma and Olivia watched wide-eyed as the ground fell away, the bay coming into view, shimmering in the morning sunlight. Their matching expressions of wonder reminded Richard why he'd fallen in love with aviation in the first place, the pure magic of defying gravity, of rising above the everyday world into the realm of clouds. As the seatbelt sign dinged off at cruising altitude, the cabin came alive with movement. Passengers adjusted seats, retrieved items from bags, and settled in for the 5-hour journey to New York. The breakfast service would begin soon, one of the few remaining full meals offered on domestic flights. Meredith moved through the cabin, taking drink orders with practiced efficiency. When she reached row 5, she smiled at the twins. "What would you like to drink?" she asked. "Apple juice, please," they replied in perfect unison, then giggled at their synchronization. "2 apple juices," Meredith confirmed, turning to Richard and Amara. "And for you?" "Coffee black," Richard requested. "Herbal tea if you have it," Amara added. Meredith nodded, making note of their orders. "Breakfast will be served shortly. We have an omelet or yogurt parfait this morning." As she moved to the next row, Richard noticed one of the late boarding passengers, a woman in her 40s with a designer handbag and an entitled air, watching the twins with poorly disguised annoyance. He'd seen that look before, the judgment of children in spaces some adults considered their exclusive domain. The woman leaned toward her traveling companion, whispering something while nodding toward Emma and Olivia. The companion, a man of similar age and equally expensive attire, glanced at the girls, then shrugged dismissively. Richard felt a familiar protective tension. He'd experienced this before, the subtle and not-so-subtle disapproval directed at his family. Sometimes it was about the children's presence in premium cabins. Other times it carried the unmistakable undercurrent of racism, the implied question of whether a South Asian family belonged in such spaces. Amara noticed his changed expression. "What is it?" she asked quietly. Richard nodded slightly toward the whispering couple. "Just the usual." Amara followed his gaze, immediately understanding. She'd navigated these waters her entire life, the sidelong glances, the whispered comments, the assumptions. As a successful business consultant specializing in diversity and inclusion, she turned this lifelong experience into professional expertise, helping corporations understand the invisible barriers faced by employees of color. "Let it go," she advised, squeezing his hand. "Not worth the energy." Richard nodded, though the protective father in him wanted to challenge the couple's obvious disapproval. Instead, he channeled his attention to the girls, who remained blissfully oblivious to the undercurrents around them, absorbed in their books and the adventure of flying. The breakfast service began, Meredith and her colleagues efficiently distributing trays throughout the cabin. The twins chose the yogurt parfait, exchanging berries between their dishes according to their individual preferences. Emma taking Olivia's blackberries, Olivia claiming Emma's strawberries. It was a familiar ritual, one that spoke to their deep connection. Richard had just taken his first sip of coffee when a commotion erupted several rows ahead. A passenger was becoming increasingly agitated, his voice rising above the ambient cabin noise. "This is completely unacceptable. I specifically requested a lactose-free meal. This omelet clearly has cheese in it." Julia appeared quickly, attempting to de-escalate the situation. "I apologize, sir. Let me check if we have any alternative options available." "I don't want alternatives. I want what I requested and what your airline confirmed." The man's face had reddened, his frustration apparent. Richard watched the interaction with professional interest. These moments, when service failures met passenger expectations, were critical touchpoints in the customer experience. How the crew handled them often determined whether a passenger became a loyal customer or a detractor. Julia maintained her composure, offering solutions rather than excuses. "We do have a fruit plate available, which is dairy-free. I can also offer you additional sides from our pantry." The passenger's anger wasn't abating. "This is exactly why I avoid Meridian whenever possible. Your attention to detail is abysmal." At this, Richard felt a stirring of defense for his airline. The catering error was unfortunate but hardly representative of Meridian's overall service quality. Under his leadership, they'd significantly improved their special meal accommodation processes, achieving an industry-leading 97% accuracy rate. Amara noticed his tension. "Not your problem today," she reminded him softly. "You're not the CEO right now." She was right, of course. Intervening would only create a scene and undermine Julia's authority. He forced himself to look away, focusing instead on his daughters who were watching the angry passenger with wide eyes. "Why is that man so upset about cheese?" Emma whispered loudly. "Some people can't digest dairy products," Richard explained quietly. "It makes them sick." "Then why doesn't he just say no thank you and eat something else?" Olivia asked, the practical one as always. "Sometimes adults forget their manners when they're frustrated," Amara answered, seizing the teachable moment. "But that's not how we handle disappointment, is it?" The twins shook their heads solemnly. Richard felt a surge of pride in their maturity, even as the disruption continued a few rows ahead. Julia had successfully convinced the angry passenger to accept the fruit plate alternative, though his complaints continued at a lower volume. As the meal service concluded, Meredith came through collecting trays. When she reached their row, she smiled at the twins who had eaten neatly and stacked their dishes properly. "Thank you," she said, genuinely appreciative of passengers who made her job easier. "Would either of you like more juice?" "Yes, please," Emma replied politely. "Me too," Olivia added. Meredith nodded approvingly. "I'll bring those right away." As she moved to the next row, Richard heard a comment from the disapproving woman he'd noticed earlier. "At least they're well-behaved," she said to her companion, just loudly enough to be heard. "Though I still don't understand why children need to be in business class. Economy is perfectly adequate." Richard felt his jaw tighten but remained silent. These subtle aggressions were all too familiar, the implied criticism of parenting choices, the suggestion that certain spaces weren't appropriate for all paying customers regardless of age. Amara caught his eye and shook her head slightly, a reminder not to engage. Throughout their marriage, they developed this silent communication, a necessary skill for navigating the microaggressions they frequently encountered together. The flight continued smoothly, the twins eventually dozing off as the morning progressed. Richard used the quiet time to review some notes for the New York meetings, though he was careful to keep his commitment to maintain family focus during the trip. Approximately 2 hours into the flight, a light chime indicated a passenger call button had been pressed. Richard glanced up to see Meredith responding to the signal from a passenger seated directly behind the twins. The man, middle-aged, wearing an expensive watch and an expression of entitlement, was gesturing toward Emma and Olivia. Richard couldn't hear the exchange, but Meredith's body language shifted subtly, her shoulders tensing as she listened to whatever complaint the passenger was voicing. She nodded professionally, then approached Richard and Amara. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "The gentleman in 6A is concerned about the children possibly reclining their seats during the flight. He's working on his laptop and needs the space." Richard felt a flash of irritation. The twins were currently asleep, their seats in the upright position. "They're not reclined at the moment," he pointed out, "and they know to be considerate of the person behind them." "I understand," Meredith replied diplomatically. "I've assured him that's the case, but I wanted to let you know of his concern." "Thank you for informing us," Amara said smoothly, stepping in before Richard's frustration could become evident. We'll make sure the girls remain mindful when they wake up. After Meredith departed, Richard shook his head. Unbelievable. The seats are designed to recline. That's part of what passengers pay for in business class. It's not worth getting upset about, Amara counseled. Choosing our battles, remember? Richard nodded reluctantly. Amara's measured approach to conflict had been a balancing influence throughout their relationship, where he tended to confront issues directly, a trait that had served him well in business but sometimes created unnecessary friction in personal interactions. She was strategic, selecting carefully which situations warranted engagement. As the flight progressed past its midpoint, turbulence began to buffet the aircraft. The captain's voice came over the PA system, instructing flight attendants to take their seats and passengers to return to their places with seatbelts fastened. The twins awoke with the jostling, their eyes wide as the plane dipped and swayed. "Dad," Emma called across the aisle, her voice tight with concern. "It's just turbulence," Richard reassured her. "Remember what we talked about? It's like driving on a bumpy road." Olivia, always the scientific one, was already explaining to her sister. "It's just disturbed air. The plane is designed to handle it." Richard smiled at his daughter's knowledge. Olivia had inherited his fascination with aviation, devouring books on aircraft design and flight physics despite her young age. The turbulence intensified briefly, then subsided. As the seatbelt sign dinged off, passengers began moving about the cabin again. The twins, now fully awake, returned to their books. Meredith resumed her service rounds, checking on passengers and offering beverages. When she reached their row, she smiled at the girls. "How are you doing? That was some bumpy air." "We're okay," Emma replied. "Dad says turbulence is normal." "He's absolutely right," Meredith confirmed. "I've been flying for 23 years and it's just part of the journey." 23 years? Olivia's eyes widened with interest. "You must know everything about airplanes." Meredith laughed, a genuine sound that softened her professional demeanor. "I know quite a bit, but I learn something new on every flight." As she continued her rounds, Richard noticed something, a slight shift in Meredith's attitude toward the twins. The initial polite professionalism had warmed into something more genuine. It was a small thing, but significant. In his position, Richard was acutely aware of how crew interactions shaped the passenger experience. The flight continued uneventfully for the next hour. The twins alternated between reading their books, playing quiet games on their tablets, and looking out the window at the landscape far below. Their behavior remained impeccable, considerate of those around them, voices kept low, movements contained to their own space. Approximately 90 minutes before landing, Emma pressed her call button. Meredith appeared promptly. "Yes, sweetie. May I please use the restroom?" Emma asked. "Of course." "It's right up there," Meredith pointed toward the front of the cabin. "Do you need help finding it?" Emma shook her head confidently. "I can do it." Richard watched as his daughter navigated the aisle carefully, avoiding contact with seated passengers. Emma's independence had always been a point of pride for her, the first to insist on tying her own shoes, making her own bed, solving her own problems. While Emma was gone, the man in 6A, the one who had complained about potential seat reclining, signaled for Meredith again. Richard couldn't hear the exchange, but Meredith's expression suggested the passenger was being difficult. When Emma returned to her seat, Meredith stopped by their row again. "Your daughter is very self-sufficient," she commented to Richard and Amara, genuine approval in her voice. "We try to encourage independence," Amara replied. "Both girls are quite capable for their age." Meredith nodded appreciatively. "It shows. You'd be surprised how many children their age require constant supervision." After she moved on, Richard reflected on the interaction. There was an unspoken validation in Meredith's comments, recognition of their parenting philosophy that valued capability and self-reliance. It was refreshing, especially given the judgment they sometimes faced from strangers. The announcement for beginning descent into New York came over the PA system. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, collecting final service items and ensuring compliance with landing preparations. As Meredith passed their row, Olivia called out, "Excuse me." Meredith paused. "Yes. Is it true that the reason our ears pop is because of pressure changes?" Olivia asked earnestly. Meredith smiled. "That's exactly right. The air pressure outside the plane changes as we descend and our ears need to adjust. I read that chewing gum helps," Olivia continued, "because swallowing equalizes the pressure." "You've done your homework," Meredith said, clearly impressed by the child's knowledge. "That's a great strategy. We also recommend yawning or pinching your nose and blowing gently if gum isn't available." Olivia nodded seriously, absorbing this professional advice. Richard watched the exchange with quiet pride. His daughter's curiosity and engagement with the world around them was something he and Amara had deliberately cultivated. encouraging questions and research from an early age. As the aircraft began its final approach to JFK, the cabin settled into the focused quiet of landing preparations. Richard glanced at his watch. They were running about 10 minutes behind schedule, but well within acceptable parameters. The New York skyline came into view through the twins' window, eliciting excited whispers between them. The landing was smooth, the aircraft touching down with barely a bump before the thrust reversers engaged with their characteristic roar. As they taxied toward the terminal, the cabin filled with the familiar sounds of post-landing impatience, seatbelts unclicking prematurely, overhead bins being opened despite announcements to remain seated, phones powering up with their various alert chimes. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to John F. Kennedy International Airport, where the local time is approximately 2:45 p.m. and the temperature is 84 degrees, came the announcement. Please remain seated with seatbelts fastened until the aircraft has come to a complete stop and the captain has turned off the fasten seatbelt sign. Richard noticed Meredith standing near the forward galley, her posture professional but fatigue evident in the set of her shoulders. The transcontinental flight was demanding for crew members who had been on duty since early morning. When the seatbelt sign finally dinged off, the usual rush to disembark began. Richard motioned for the twins to remain seated, another lesson in courtesy he'd instilled in them. Let those with tight connections or urgent business deplane first. As business class began to empty, Richard gathered their belongings. Ready for New York, girls. Emma and Olivia nodded enthusiastically, collecting their backpacks and books. Remember to thank the crew on your way out, Amara reminded them, a routine part of their travel protocol. As they moved toward the exit, the twins stopped in front of Meredith, who stood by the door bidding passengers farewell. Thank you for taking care of us, they said in near unison. Meredith smiled warmly. You were wonderful passengers. Enjoy New York. As Richard passed, he nodded appreciatively to Meredith. Thank you for your service today. My pleasure, sir. Have a great stay in New York. As they walked up the jet bridge, Richard felt a small surge of satisfaction. The flight had been a success, smooth, on time, with professional service. More importantly, the twins had handled their first semi-independent travel experience with maturity. The family trip was off to an excellent start. Little did he know that 3 days later, on the return flight to San Francisco, this same crew would be working, and circumstances would unfold very differently. The Evans-Shorey family spent 3 wonderful days in New York, a whirlwind of activities centered around the twins' interests. The Natural History Museum for science-loving Olivia, a Broadway show for theatrical Emma, and plenty of time with Amara's parents, who doted on their only grandchildren. On their final evening, as they packed for the return flight, Richard received an urgent call from his office. The Suncoast merger had hit a regulatory snag, requiring his immediate attention upon return to San Francisco. I'm sorry, he told Amara as he ended the call. I'll need to head straight to the office from the airport tomorrow. Amara sighed but nodded understanding. The girls will be disappointed. They were hoping for ice cream at that place by the bay. I know. Richard felt the familiar weight of competing priorities. I'll make it up to them this weekend. The next morning brought unexpected complications. Traffic to JFK was snarled by an accident, cutting their comfortable time margin to minutes. By the time they reached the terminal, boarding for their return flight to San Francisco was well underway. We'll make it, Richard assured the anxious twins as they hurried through security. His CEO credentials could have expedited the process, but he preferred to maintain their low profile, not wanting special treatment. They reached Gate 27 just as final boarding was being announced. Richard noticed the same aircraft from their outbound journey, a coincidence in the rotation schedule. As they hurried down the jet bridge, he recognized Julia Chen at the door, the same purser from their flight to New York. Welcome aboard, she greeted them, showing no sign of recognizing them from the previous flight. Her professionalism was impeccable. The business class cabin was already full, passengers settled into their seats. As they made their way to row 5, Richard noted several familiar faces from their outbound journey, the airline's schedule creating a rhythm of regular travelers on specific routes. Girls, same seats as before, he directed, helping them stow their backpacks. 5A and B, Emma and Olivia slid into their window and middle seats, slightly breathless from the rush to board. Today they wore different but still matching Galaxy Girls t-shirts, this pair featuring the characters in spacesuits exploring an alien planet. We made it, Amara said with relief as she took her seat across the aisle. Though I think we're the last ones on. Indeed, moments after they settled in, the cabin door closed with a definitive thunk. The familiar announcements began, the safety briefing following its regulated script. Richard noticed Meredith Palmer moving through the cabin, performing final checks. She was again assigned to the business class cabin for this flight. When she reached their row, she smiled in recognition at the twins. "Hello again," she said warmly. "Back to San Francisco today?" The girls nodded, pleased to be remembered. "We saw a Broadway show," Emma informed her excitedly. "And the dinosaur exhibit at the museum," Olivia added. "Sounds wonderful," Meredith replied. "I'll be taking care of you again today. Let me know if you need anything." As she moved on, Richard noted the genuine warmth in her interaction with the twins, a marked difference from the professional courtesy of their first meeting. It was a small thing, but significant. In the service industry, these human connections made all the difference to the customer experience. The flight departed on schedule, climbing out of JFK and banking west toward San Francisco. Once at cruising altitude, the meal service began, lunch this time, given the midday departure. The twins chose the pasta option, eating neatly while continuing their animated discussion of New York highlights. Across the aisle, Richard reviewed merger documents on his tablet, preparing for the meetings that would consume him upon landing. "You promised," Amara reminded him gently, nodding toward his screen. Richard sighed, putting the tablet away. "You're right, work can wait." Midway through the flight, a minor disruption occurred. The passenger in 6C, directly behind Olivia, became increasingly vocal about his dissatisfaction with the entertainment system, which had frozen on his screen. "This is ridiculous," he complained loudly to Meredith. "I paid for business class. I expect functioning equipment." Meredith attempted to reset his system, her practiced patience evident. "I apologize for the inconvenience, sir. Sometimes these systems need a complete restart." The man continued grumbling, his voice carrying through the cabin. "Every time I fly Meridian, something goes wrong. You'd think with the prices you charge, you could maintain basic functionality." Richard felt a twinge of professional concern. In-flight entertainment issues were among the most common passenger complaints, a persistent challenge despite significant investment in system upgrades. He made a mental note to follow up with the technology team about reliability metrics. The twins, meanwhile, had turned in their seats to observe the interaction, their curiosity evident. The disgruntled passenger noticed their attention and frowned. "Turn around," he snapped at them. "It's rude to stare." Emma and Olivia immediately faced forward, expressions crestfallen at the harsh tone. Richard felt a surge of protective anger. "Earls," he said clearly, ensuring the passenger could hear, "you weren't doing anything wrong, but let's give the gentleman his privacy." The subtle rebuke was not lost on the passenger, who had the grace to look slightly abashed before returning to his complaints about the entertainment system. Meredith, who had witnessed the exchange, gave Richard an appreciative glance before continuing her efforts to resolve the technical issue. As the flight progressed, the cabin settled into the rhythm of long-haul travel. Passengers dozed, worked on laptops, or watched movies. The twins, having exhausted their excitement about New York, grew tired. Emma leaned against the window, soon asleep, while Olivia continued reading her book on aircraft. About 2 hours before landing, Richard excused himself to use the lavatory. In the narrow aisle, he passed Julia, who was checking on passengers in the first-class cabin ahead. "Everything all right with your flight, sir?" she asked professionally. "Yes, thank you," Richard replied, maintaining his anonymity. When he returned to his seat, he found Amara engaged in conversation with Meredith, who had stopped by during her service round. "Consulting work primarily," Amara was saying. "Diversity and inclusion strategies for Fortune 500 companies." "That sounds fascinating," Meredith replied. "I imagine there's growing demand for that expertise." "There is, though implementation remains challenging in many organizations," Amara acknowledged. "The airline industry has made progress, but there's still work to be done." Richard slipped back into his seat, interested in where this conversation might go. Amara's work often provided valuable insights for Meridian's own diversity initiatives. "I've been flying for 23 years, Meredith said, a hint of reflection in her voice. "The changes I've seen in crew demographics have been significant, though the executive level remains." She paused, perhaps remembering she was speaking to passengers. "Less diverse," Amara supplied with a knowing smile. Meredith nodded diplomatically. "Exactly, though I understand Meridian has been more progressive than most under its current leadership." Richard suppressed a smile at this unintended compliment to his own efforts. Since taking the helm 5 years ago, he'd made diversifying the executive team a priority, increasing representation of women and people of color by 34%. "The girls mentioned you've been flying for over 2 decades, Amara said, changing the subject slightly. "They were quite impressed." Meredith smiled, glancing at the twins, Emma still asleep, Olivia now dozing as well, her book open on her lap. "They're wonderful children, so well-behaved and curious. You should be proud." Thank you, Amara replied warmly. That means a lot, especially coming from someone who's seen it all in terms of passenger behavior. A chime from another row interrupted their conversation, and Meredith excused herself to attend to it. As she walked away, Amara turned to Richard. I like her, she said quietly. There's a genuine quality there beneath the professional exterior. Richard nodded agreement. In his position, he was acutely aware of the challenges faced by frontline employees, the physical demands, the emotional labor, the need to maintain composure in the face of sometimes difficult passengers. Meredith embodied the best of Meridian's service culture, balancing professionalism with authentic human connection. As the flight began its initial descent into San Francisco, the captain's announcement roused the twins from their naps. They stretched and blinked, momentarily disoriented before remembering where they were. Are we almost home? Emma asked, peering out the window at the clouds below. About 30 minutes, Richard confirmed. Time to pack up your things. The girls obediently gathered their books and tablets, tucking them into their backpacks. Meredith came through the cabin for a final service check, collecting headphones and glasses. Did you enjoy your nap? She asked the twins with a smile. Yes, thank you, Olivia replied politely. Are we really flying at 550 miles per hour? Meredith looked impressed by the specific question. That's right. How did you know that? I read it in my airplane book, Olivia explained, holding up her aviation guide. It says a Boeing 777 cruises at between 540 and 560 miles per hour depending on wind conditions. You might have a future pilot on your hands, Meredith commented to Richard and Amara. She's been fascinated by aircraft since she was 4, Amara confirmed. Knows more about them than I do already. The plane continued its descent, breaking through the cloud layer to reveal the bay area below. The familiar landscape came into view, the Golden Gate Bridge visible in the distance, the city's distinctive skyline, the blue expanse of the bay dotted with ships. Look, Dad, Emma called excitedly. I can see our building, Richard smiled at her enthusiasm. Their apartment in a high-rise near the financial district was indeed visible from this approach path, a fact that never failed to delight the twins. As the aircraft made its final approach to SFO, the cabin crew completed landing preparations. Meredith moved efficiently through the business class section, ensuring compliance with regulations, seats upright, tray tables stowed, electronic devices off or in airplane mode. The landing was smooth, the aircraft touching down with barely a bump before the thrust reversers engaged with their characteristic roar. As they taxied toward the terminal, the usual post-landing rituals began, phones powering up, seatbelts unclicking prematurely, passengers gathering belongings despite announcements to remain seated. Richard checked his watch. They were right on schedule, which meant he would have time to drop Amara and the girls at home before heading to the office for the merger crisis meeting. Not ideal, but at least he wouldn't have to go directly from the airport. When the seatbelt sign finally dinged off, Richard stood to retrieve their carry-on items from the overhead compartment. The twins remained seated, following the courteous protocol he'd taught them about deplaning. Let's let those with connections go first, he reminded them, noting several passengers anxiously waiting in the aisle. As business class began to empty, an unexpected complication arose. The passenger who had complained about the entertainment system, seated in 6C behind Olivia, attempted to push past a woman with mobility issues who was slowly gathering her belongings. Excuse me, he said impatiently, trying to squeeze through the narrow space. The woman, older and using a cane, was clearly flustered by his pressure. I'm moving as quickly as I can, she replied, her voice tight with embarrassment. Richard observed Meredith stepping in smoothly, her experience evident in her handling of the situation. Sir, please allow others the time they need, she said firmly but professionally. Everyone will deplane shortly. The man grumbled but stepped back, his frustration evident. The incident highlighted a reality Richard was all too familiar with, the increasing tension in air travel, the compression of space and time that seemed to bring out both the best and worst in human behavior. When it was finally their turn to move into the aisle, Richard ushered the twins forward, Amara following behind. They made their way toward the exit, where Julia and Meredith stood bidding passengers farewell. Thank you for flying with us today, Julia said as they approached. Thanks for taking care of us, the twins replied in their practiced travel courtesy. Meredith smiled warmly at them. It was my pleasure. You were wonderful passengers. As they proceeded up the jet bridge, Richard reflected on the successful completion of their family trip. Despite his work intrusions, they'd managed quality time together, memories created, bonds strengthened. The twins had proven themselves capable travelers, a small but significant step in their development. Little did he know that in less than 20 minutes he would be returning to that same aircraft, under very different circumstances. The terminal was bustling with afternoon activity as the Evans-Shorey family made their way toward ground transportation. Richard's phone buzzed with a message from his chief of staff. "Urgent update on Suncoast. Call immediately," he sighed, showing the message to Amara. "I need to make this call. You three go ahead to baggage claim and I'll catch up." Amara nodded understanding, though her expression conveyed mild disappointment. "Girls, let's go get our suitcases. Dad needs to make a work call." As his family continued toward the escalators, Richard stepped aside to a quieter area near a window overlooking the tarmac. The call with his chief of staff was brief but concerning. The regulatory hurdles to the Suncoast merger had multiplied overnight, with a key government official unexpectedly opposing the deal. "I need to go back to the office immediately," Richard concluded. "Let the team know I'll be there in an hour." As he ended the call, his attention was caught by activity on the tarmac below. A service vehicle was racing toward the aircraft they had just deplaned, their arrival gate now preparing for its next departure. Something about the urgency of the vehicle's movement triggered Richard's professional instincts. After 20 years in the airline industry, he had developed a sixth sense for operational irregularities. His phone buzzed again, this time a priority alert from Meridian's operational control center. He opened the message, his concern growing as he read. "Service disruption on Flight 518 SFO to Chicago. CEO attention may be required." Flight 518 was the next departure from the gate they had just arrived at, using the same aircraft. Whatever the issue was, it involved the plane they had just left. Richard dialed the operations center directly, identifying himself. "This is Evans. What's happening with 518? The operations manager's voice was tense. "Sir, we have a situation developing with a crew member and passengers. Initial reports suggest a potential discrimination incident involving unaccompanied minors. Social media activity already beginning." Richard's stomach tightened. These situations could escalate rapidly, damaging both customer relations and brand reputation. "I'm still at the airport, Terminal 2. What gate is 518? "Gate 42, sir. Same as your arrival." "I'm heading there now. Keep me updated." Richard ended the call, already moving back toward the gate area. He sent a quick text to Amara. "Potential situation with the flight we just left. Need to check it out. Take girls home, I'll call later." As he approached Gate 42, Richard could immediately sense the tension in the air. A small crowd had gathered near the gate desk, voices raised. Airport security officers were present but hanging back, monitoring rather than intervening. The departure board showed Flight 518 to Chicago, status now changed to delayed. Richard slowed his approach, assessing the situation before revealing his identity. Years of crisis management had taught him the value of understanding the full picture before taking action. At the center of the commotion, he was surprised to see Meredith Palmer, the flight attendant who had served their business class cabin. She was standing near the jet bridge entrance, her professional composure clearly strained as she spoke with what appeared to be a family, 2 women and 2 children. "As I explained," Meredith was saying, her voice tight with controlled emotion, "business class is fully booked. If you were assigned those seats, there may have been a system error, but I cannot allow unaccompanied minors in business class without proper documentation." One of the women, tall, with short silver hair and an air of dignified outrage, stepped forward. "These children are not unaccompanied. We are their parents, and we specifically purchased business class seats for this family trip. Your assumption that they must be in the wrong section is exactly the problem here." The second woman had her arms around the 2 children, both around 8 years old, with short hair and wearing jeans and t-shirts similar to Emma and Olivia's travel outfits. The children looked confused and upset, one of them clearly fighting back tears. Julia Chen had now joined the scene, attempting to mediate. "Let's verify the reservations," she suggested calmly. "There may be a simple misunderstanding." A male passenger emerging from the jet bridge paused to film the interaction on his phone, adding to the tension. Others were doing the same, the modern instinct to document conflict instantly transforming a service issue into potential viral content. Richard recognized the volatile situation for what it was, a moment that could define his airline's reputation for better or worse. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, deliberately removing his suit jacket to make his airline ID badge visible on his shirt pocket. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the natural authority that had helped propel him to his position. "I'm Richard Evans, CEO of Meridian Airlines. What seems to be the problem here?" The reaction was immediate, heads turning, whispers spreading through the gathered crowd. Julia's eyes widened in recognition, though Meredith seemed too focused on the situation to immediately register his significance. "Mr. Evans," Julia acknowledged professionally, "we have a seating discrepancy with this family for flight 518. The silver-haired woman stepped toward Richard, her expression a mix of surprise and determination. "I'm Dr. Alina Winters, and this is my wife, Dr. Samantha Winters. We booked business-class seats for our family trip to Chicago, but your flight attendant," she nodded toward Meredith, "has informed our children that these seats aren't for you and attempted to relocate them to economy, despite our paid reservations." Meredith's face had paled as she realized she was now facing not just an angry passenger, but her airline's CEO. "Sir, she began, but Richard raised a hand slightly, indicating she should wait. "Dr. Winters," he addressed the woman directly, "I apologize for any misunderstanding. Let me look into this personally." He turned to Julia. "May I see the reservation details, please?" Julia quickly produced a tablet with the passenger manifest. Richard reviewed it, immediately seeing the issue. The reservation for the Winters family showed 4 business-class seats, the parents in 5C and 5D, the children in 5A and B, the very seats his own daughters had occupied on both their flights. "I see the problem," he said, looking up. "Dr. and Dr. Winters, your reservations are indeed for business class, all 4 of you. There appears to have been a misunderstanding." He turned to Meredith, whose professional composure was cracking under the combined pressure of the situation and his presence. "Ms. Palmer, can you explain what happened?" Meredith swallowed visibly. "Sir, when I saw the children approaching the business class seats unaccompanied, I assumed there had been a mistake. The manifest listed unaccompanied minors in those seats on our inbound flight, so I thought. She told our children these seats aren't for you," the second Dr. Winters interjected, her arm still protectively around the children. "She assumed they didn't belong in business class based on their appearance despite their boarding passes." The implications hung in the air. Assumptions made, bias displayed, judgment passed. The crowd of onlookers had grown, many openly recording the interaction on phones. Richard was acutely aware of the public relations implications unfolding in real time. "Ms. Palmer," Richard said, his tone measured, "were the children's boarding passes checked?" "They had boarding passes for those seats," Meredith acknowledged, her voice smaller now. "But given my experience with the inbound flight where children were incorrectly listed as unaccompanied, I thought." "There was no incorrect listing on the inbound flight," Richard interrupted gently. "Daughters were in those seats, traveling with my wife and me seated across the aisle." Meredith's eyes widened in sudden recognition. "Your daughters," but she stopped abruptly, the implications of her assumption becoming clear to her. The twins she had assumed were boys on the first encounter before warming to them throughout the journey had been the CEO's daughters. The situation crystallized for everyone present. An assumption had been made, twice, about children's belonging in premium cabins based on appearance. First with Richard's daughters, then with the Winters' children. In both cases, the children had short hair and wore casual clothes. In both cases, Meredith had initially assumed they were boys who didn't belong. "I think I understand what happened here," Richard said carefully. He turned to the Winters family. "Dr. and Dr. Winters, on behalf of Meridian Airlines, I sincerely apologize for this incident. Your children absolutely have the right to the business class seats you purchased, and they should never have been made to feel otherwise." He then addressed Meredith directly, but spoke loudly enough for others to hear. "Ms. Palmer, it appears you made an assumption about these children based on their appearance, similar to an assumption you initially made about my own daughters on our inbound flight. While I understand the challenges of quick judgments in customer service, this is exactly the kind of unconscious bias our company training is designed to address." Meredith's face flushed with embarrassment and realization. "Sir, I didn't mean to. That is, I never intended." "I know you didn't," Richard said, his tone softening slightly. "Intent and impact are different things, as our diversity training emphasizes. The impact here was that children were made to feel they didn't belong in a space their parents had rightfully purchased access to." The crowd had grown silent, witnessing what had become an impromptu master class in crisis management and leadership. Richard was conscious of the dozens of phones recording, knowing his handling of this moment would be scrutinized on social media within hours. He turned back to the Winters family. "Your flight has been delayed by this incident, and for that, I apologize. I'd like to offer you complimentary premium services for your journey today and a travel voucher for future flights. More importantly, I want to assure you that this incident will lead to concrete changes in our training protocols." Dr. Alina Winters studied him thoughtfully. "Mr. Evans, what concerns us most isn't compensation, but ensuring other families don't face similar situations. Our children shouldn't have to justify their presence in any space they have a right to occupy. I couldn't agree more, Richard replied sincerely. And I give you my word that this incident will drive meaningful change. Would you be willing to speak with me briefly after your family is settled on the aircraft? Your insights would be valuable as we address this systematically. The Winters exchanged glances, then nodded agreement. Richard turned to Julia. Please ensure the Winters family is personally escorted to their seats and receives VIP treatment throughout their journey. I'd like to speak with Ms. Palmer privately. As Julia led the family toward the jet bridge, Richard gestured for Meredith to follow him to a quieter area away from the crowd. Her face was a mask of professional composure, but he could see the distress beneath. Ms. Palmer, he began once they were relatively private, how long have you been with Meridian? 23 years, sir, she replied, her voice steady despite her evident anxiety. That's significant experience, Richard acknowledged. Which makes this situation all the more concerning. Can you help me understand what happened from your perspective? Meredith took a deep breath. When I saw the children approaching business class alone, I made an assumption based on past experiences. Unaccompanied minors are often confused about their seating assignments. I didn't wait to check their boarding passes thoroughly before suggesting they were in the wrong place. And on our inbound flight, with my daughters, Richard pressed gently. Meredith's professional facade cracked slightly. I assumed they were boys, sir. With their short hair and t-shirts, I thought. I made a judgment without proper information. Once I realized they were traveling with you and your wife, I corrected my approach, but the initial assumption was there. Richard nodded thoughtfully. Ms. Palmer, I believe you're a dedicated professional who made a human error. However, that error reveals something important about the unconscious biases we all carry. As a company, we need to do better. As individuals, we need to recognize when our assumptions color our actions. Yes, sir, Meredith replied quietly. I understand. Will I be? She hesitated, the question of her continued employment hanging unspoken between them. Terminated? No, Richard answered directly. But there will be consequences, including additional training and temporary reassignment. More importantly, I want you to be part of the solution. Your experience could be valuable in helping us improve our approach to these issues. Relief visibly washed over Meredith, followed by a renewed professionalism. Thank you, sir. I take full responsibility for my actions, and I'm committed to learning from this. Good. Richard checked his watch. The flight needs to depart. Please take the rest of the day off with pay. Report to HR tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. and we'll discuss next steps. As Meredith nodded and departed, Richard returned to the gate area, where the crowd had begun to disperse. The immediate crisis had been managed, but he knew the real work was just beginning. This incident would require thoughtful follow-through, not just a PR response, but genuine organizational change. He approached the gate desk, where a somewhat starstruck agent was attempting to maintain normal operations despite the unusual presence of the CEO. Please inform the captain of 518 that they're cleared for an immediate departure once the Winters family is settled, Richard instructed. And I'll need a full incident report from all staff involved by tomorrow morning. As Flight 518 finally pushed back from the gate 30 minutes behind schedule, Richard stood at the window watching it taxi away. His phone had been buzzing constantly, the operations center, his PR team, his executive assistant, all responding to the quickly spreading news of the incident. He finally answered a call from his chief communications officer. Evans, he said simply. Sir, we're seeing social media activity about an incident at SFO, the voice came urgently. Something about discrimination against children in business class. There are videos. I know, Marcus, I was there, Richard replied calmly. I've handled the immediate situation. We need a comprehensive response strategy. Gather the crisis team and prepare for a video statement from me within the hour. This isn't just a PR issue, it's a moment for substantive change. As he ended the call, Richard's phone buzzed with a text from Amara. Just saw Twitter. Are you okay? What happened? He texted back quickly. Handling it. Will explain everything tonight. Tell the girls I love them. Looking out at the San Francisco skyline through the terminal windows, Richard reflected on the complexity of the moment. What had begun as a family vacation had transformed into a profound professional challenge, one that touched on issues of bias, assumption, and belonging that resonated far beyond this single incident. As CEO, he had always spoken about Meridian's commitment to inclusion and diversity. Now, those values were being tested in real time under public scrutiny. His response would define not just his leadership, but the company's culture for years to come. With a deep breath, Richard turned from the window and headed toward the executive offices in Terminal 2. The merger crisis that had seemed so urgent an hour ago now took second place to a more fundamental challenge. ensuring that every passenger, regardless of appearance, age, or background, felt they belonged in whatever seat they had rightfully purchased. The incident had begun with 5 simple words. "These seats aren't for you," words that carried unintended weight and revealed unconscious biases. The resolution would require many more words, but more importantly, decisive action. As he walked through the terminal, Richard began mentally drafting not just his public statement, but the substantive changes that would ensure such words were never again spoken to any child on his airline. The true measure of leadership, he reflected, wasn't avoiding crises. It was responding to them in ways that created meaningful, lasting improvement. In that sense, perhaps those 5 misguided words might ultimately make Meridian a better airline for everyone. If you enjoyed this powerful story about judgment, bias, and the importance of seeing beyond our assumptions, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking content. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments below.